the voicemail tips. So the first thing I would want you to do is to take a step back and try to understand the prospect that you're calling and that you're thinking about maybe leaving a voicemail message for. And the first thing to understand about them is that prospects are often away from their desks. And this is something important to be aware of, because when you get voicemail box so often, in fact, actually when you call the same prospect and always get their voicemail box, you can start to think that they are avoiding you. If you're calling decision makers that are at a manager level, it's very likely that they are just not at their desk every single time you call. Just from my experience working in the corporate world, I've often looked at, sometimes maybe not my calendar, but I've looked at my manager's calendar, and it was block after block after block where they were away from their desk most of the day, which means when you call them, that's why you're getting their voicemail. And this is just something to understand and keep in mind when prospects don't answer your phone. Not only could they be away in meetings all day, but I recall working for some companies where managers could be traveling for a week or multiple weeks at a time, sometimes international, and they're just never there. So that's just something to keep in mind and factor in regarding what you say and when you leave voicemails and what you're thinking about. The other thing is that your prospects get calls from a lot of salespeople, and so they also get voicemails from a lot of salespeople. Because prospects get so many voicemail messages from salespeople, it could very likely be physically impossible for them to listen to all their messages. If you imagine let's say a manager being away from their desk, they come back and their voicemail box is full, their email inbox has a ton of emails unread, and they've been working all day, and it's either try to wrap up real quickly so they can get home and have dinner with their family or listen to a bunch of messages. What I'm trying to say there is that it's very reasonable for many of the messages to get deleted without being heard at all, or they start to hear a message, and as soon as they can identify that it's not important, or maybe that it's a salesperson trying to sell something, they hit the delete button. And even if they do listen to your message, I think it's important to come to terms with a potential reality that prospects do not return calls from salespeople. When a salesperson says, "Hey, please give me a call back," it's a very low probability that that prospect will return that call. And I want to drill into that one thought in a little more detail, because it could sound a little pessimistic or a little negative to be a salesperson and think, oh, nobody's going to return your call. By the way, I think this is also important to talk about, because it's interesting how many salespeople talk to us regarding consulting and coaching and scripting, where they express concerns that their prospects don't ever call them back. And they want to develop a script that gets more prospects to call them back. And I think that that's a flawed concern, or a misguided level of effort into where they need to try to make improvements, because I personally believe that there's a low probability that prospects call salespeople back, and I base this assumption on a few factors. First, we've already discussed many times that the prospect is very busy, and if they're extremely busy, most likely they could be too busy to call a salesperson back. It could be very possible that a salesperson leaves a message and the prospect does not have interest. If the prospect is not interested, then the prospect likely will not call back. It's not to say that the prospect might not be able to become interested, but if they don't know who you are and you're a salesperson and you try to create a little intrigue in a voicemail message, it's most likely not going to be enough interest or intrigue to motivate them to pick up the phone and call you back. It could be the reality that if you're calling a manager, most likely they might have a level of ego in terms of their status and how they view themselves, right? So if they're normally giving salespeople tennis balls and throwing them and having salespeople chase their tennis balls, when you leave a voicemail and ask that prospect to call you back, you're throwing a tennis ball and asking that prospect to chase after your tennis ball and to bring it to you. And it could be very likely that with the only reason they don't call you back is because they are important and they know, either think they're important or they know they're important, and they're above calling a salesperson back. It could also be that they know maybe they're interested. Maybe they think they might need what you sell, but they might view you as a salesperson, and they know salespeople continue to call and call and call. So you know what? They might just say, "Oh, I'll talk to them the next time they call because I know they're going to call again." And you know what? If we completely have an ultimate optimistic outlook, we could say, you know, there could be the possibility that the prospect says, "I want to talk to this person." They write down your phone number from your voicemail message, put it on a piece of paper, and they forget to call you back because they're so busy and there's so many messages and so many things to do. And like I already mentioned, it could also be the case that they don't even hear your message. So when you factor in all those very reasonable and realistic factors, it's very safe to say that there's a low probability that if you're a salesperson calling someone you don't know and you maybe look like you're trying to sell something, that it's a very low probability that the prospect is going to call you back. That doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't leave a voicemail message, but it can factor in terms of when we leave a message and what we're thinking about when we leave a message and after we leave a message. So the real question is do we leave a message or not? And that is the question that we will answer here today. And the reality is that even though prospects are most likely not to call you back, it is one form of communication that you have to communicate with the prospect. It's not a great one because we know that they're going to delete a lot of messages, but it is one that you have in addition to the phone, email, physical mail, social media. So you might as well use it. We'll talk about how to use it in the most optimum way here today. So there are a few benefits to the DNLVM, which is do not leave voicemail message. So shorthand for that you did not leave a voicemail message for a prospect. So 3 benefits to not leaving a voicemail message are, one is it takes time to leave a voicemail message. Think if you're making 100 dials a day, if you left a voicemail message for every prospect or a big percentage of those calls, how much time would that take? You know, so if you don't leave voicemails, you can save all that added up time to make more dials. But it's the third thing that I think is most powerful, which is if you don't leave a voicemail message for a prospect, you can call a prospect back more often or more times. For example, if I call you and I leave a voicemail message for you today, I need to pause a certain amount of days before trying you again. I personally believe you should probably pause for a week, but it should at least be a few days to a week before I call you again. But if I call you today and I get your voicemail and I hang up, I can call you back tomorrow and try you again because I'm assuming that you don't know I called and you don't have a message telling you to call me back. So for all I know is I'm trying you again and you don't know I called, so I don't really have to worry about seeming like a pest because I didn't leave a voicemail message. I could call you every day. In fact, I want to kind of go through a scenario here of how you could piece together your calls without voicemail and when you do leave a voicemail into somewhat of a schedule. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about getting your foot in the door of new accounts, and I'm going to combine the schedule of leaving voicemail messages with making calls and sending emails and how to piece that all together in terms of the frequency and number of attempts. So I'll build the full picture in the next chapter, but just regarding leaving voicemail message, if you did not leave a voicemail message on one day, DNLVM, then since you didn't leave a voicemail message, you could do that, let's say 3-4 times, and then on the 5th attempt, you could then leave a voicemail message. And that type of schedule you could spread across maybe a 1 week or 5 call attempts. So if you're maybe doing call a day, then that would be 1 business week. If you're calling a couple times, maybe this is 2 to 3, 4 days. But the key thing here is after you leave that voicemail message, then you want to pause with no calls for a period of 1 week. Then after that week expires, you can start to call again, and you can begin your schedule of a handful of calls over a few days with not leaving a voicemail message. And then after that set of calls, then you want to leave a voicemail message, and then that could be spread across another week or 5 call attempts. So just to give you some ideas, hopefully one takeaway there is, as you can see, if you don't leave a voicemail message, you can call very frequently without really worrying about it. And then once you leave the message, deliver a message that has a certain goal and designed a certain way, pause, and then pick back up. Again, this is one part of a full schedule of prospecting attempts, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. Now, I mentioned we're going to leave a voicemail message that should be focused on the right goal, and I also mentioned the fact that I recommend you assume that the prospect is not going to call you back. So with that, what I recommend you do is try to focus on the right goal with your voicemail message, or really messages. And I don't want you to talk about the product too much or try to sell the product or sell the meeting. So what I think you can do is use your voicemail messages as a way to communicate and educate the prospect. Educate the prospect on who you are, why you're calling, and why they should talk to you. And I'll show you how to do that with some voicemail examples. Regarding how to do that, we need to design the messages the messages that you use for your voicemail messages. And what we can use is the level 1 sales message that we created as part of the sales system. We talked about that in an earlier chapter. All of the different things that we brainstormed, we can use for your voicemail messages, and we can use your building blocks, and I'll show you that in a second. If we are assuming that the prospect is less likely to call us back, this is very important and helpful, because that can help you to change your expectations. And going back to the salespeople that I talk to that are frustrated because no one ever returns their calls, the problem with that is that they're feeling frustration, they're getting down on themselves, they're starting to have a weak mindset. And the reality is that that's a totally inaccurate way for them to be feeling. What they're forgetting, or they're not aware of, is that it's completely normal that the prospect is not calling them back. I started to learn this in my early prospecting days when nobody called me back. And then one day, after a ton of voicemail messages, a prospect finally called me back. And I realized after talking to him for a few minutes, the prospect was very low in the organization, and he had nothing going on, and he really didn't seem really very important and all that intelligent, to be completely honest. And what I realized was the reason why this guy called me back was because he had no power and he had no importance in the organization. That tells me one thing, is that the people who have power and are important are not calling people back. So if you're calling decision makers, they're not calling you back. And if someone even does call you back, it's almost a reason to disqualify them as someone that you should even spend your valuable time with. So getting back to your expectations, when you're aware that you're leaving a voicemail message, but there's a low probability that they will call you back, you can change from expecting or hoping for them to call you back to expecting them not to call you back. This can impact you in 2 ways. One is it can help you to have a healthier, more positive mindset. When you leave a dozen voicemails each day and nobody calls you back, you're not going to be too worried about it. The other thing this can help you with is this can help you to prevent you from writing off prospects as uninterested. Because if you leave a prospect, let's say 2 voicemail messages, and then you think to yourself, well, I left them 2 voicemail messages and they never call me back, so they must not be interested, so I'm going to stop calling them, then you might be walking away prematurely. But if you're more aware that it's normal that they're not calling me back, then you know that it's completely appropriate for you to keep calling them back, and it's completely appropriate and normal for them not to be calling you. So it's a very big improvement for you to modify and get your expectations in the right direction. So we know that the prospect's not likely to call us back. I actually recommend that you do not ask the prospect to call you back, and I do this for a couple reasons. The first reason is because, as we've discussed, there's an extremely low probability that the prospect's going to call you back. So why ask them to call you back? Why ask them to do something that they're not likely to do? And then you're put in a situation where you need to pause. I want you to pause anyways, but there's a difference between pausing because you're waiting for your next callback versus pausing, waiting for them to call you back. Then they don't call you back, then you call them back after you ask them to call you back. So you're kind of displaying a level of weakness to the prospect. Most likely they won't remember it, but nonetheless, when you say call me back and then you're the one who's calling them back, it's a weaker position for you to be in. Either it's a weaker way for you to present yourself, or it's a weaker way that you're going to impact the way you mentally view yourself. But the other reason why I say don't ask the prospect to call you back is because you're giving the prospect a task to perform. And if you're doing cold prospecting, you've never spoken to them, you know who they are, they don't know who you are, and here you are. Wait, by the way, you're the one that wants to talk to them at this point. They don't necessarily want to talk to you at this point, and you're asking them to perform an activity or perform some sort of task to do. So I think that's actually not only, I think it's a little rude for a salesperson to do that to a prospect. You need to view yourself as the servant for the prospect. You work for the prospect. Now, sure, once you establish the relationship and you're in the sales process, you could ask the prospect to give you a call back. You have a rapport and a relationship there. Or when you're building out a partnership and you need the prospect to invest in the sales process, no problem at all asking the prospect to call you back. But at the very beginning, you're the one that's trying to get things started. I recommend that you send a voicemail follow-up email after every single voicemail that you leave. This is important for a couple reasons. One is it reinforces your message. So if you're trying to educate the prospect on who you are, why you're calling, why they should talk to you, and you explain that in your voicemail, then you also send an email that reinforces that message as follow-up. You're reinforcing it if they happen to see and hear both, if they happen to receive both messages, should I say. If they don't receive both messages, you're basically creating some redundancy there. So you're increasing the odds that they hear your message. And you are also providing an easier way for the prospect to respond to you if they happen to choose to respond to you. It's much easier to reply to an email by clicking reply, typing out a few words, than it is to write someone's phone number down, pick up the phone, call them. There might be a great probability that when they return your call, they get your voicemail, and then there might be some phone tag, and it's just very cumbersome and difficult, much easier for them to reply to your email. Also, lastly, it's very easy for them to extract and save your contact information in an email. When they're listening to a voicemail message, they would have to write it down. They might have to hit rewind. You might speak too fast. They might not clearly hear your number. With an email, most likely you have a signature. They can see your contact information. They can also file your email away in a folder, which is easier than writing down some notes on a pad that often might get turned to a different page the next day and never turned back to. So best practice, voicemail follow-up email after every voicemail message.